All right, I want you to picture this. You are standing at an elevation of 7,500 feet. The air up there, it's so thin it almost feels like it's hollowing out your lungs. You can hear the wind just howling off the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, and you're standing inside this massive, drafty wooden palace that feels, well, completely stuck in 1909. You're totally isolated. So today, we're skipping the usual intro stuff because we are diving straight into the chilling, sensory-rich atmosphere of America's absolute most infamous haunted destination. We're going to tear down the myths, the legends, and the Hollywood magic to examine the real anatomy of the Stanley Hotel. Okay, let's dive into this. Notice the really intense visual contrast going on here. On one hand, you've got this incredibly bright, pristine, perfectly symmetrical neo-Georgian architecture. I mean, it literally screams East Coast elite, right? But then, look at what's looming right behind it. You have these jagged, chaotic, completely indifferent Rocky Mountains. It's a total visual paradox. You've got a literal palace just sitting out in the middle of this rugged wilderness. And, it's exactly that intense physical isolation that really sets the stage for the whole shebang that follows. And man, nobody felt that creeping isolation quite like the author Stephen King. Back in late October of 1974, King and his wife checked in on literally the very last night of this season. They were the only guests in this massive labyrinth of 140 empty rooms. Just think about that. That intense, almost suffocating sensory deprivation actually led to a nightmare that kind of changed pop culture forever. King dreamt of his 3-year-old son running down these empty corridors, just screaming, being chased by, get this, a sentient fire hose. No way, right? Well, King woke up within an inch of falling completely out of bed, went to the window, smoked a cigarette, and by the time he put it out, he basically had the bones for his legendary novel, The Shining. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to really understand how the Stanley became such a legend, you have to trace its totally bizarre journey. So, it opens back in 1909 as this elite social hub. But look at 1911, boom, a massive gas explosion literally shakes the foundation, and we're going to unpack that in a second. Then you fast forward through decades of neglect where the place was almost demolished until we hit 1974 with King's fateful visit. The Shining hits the shelves in 77 and it completely changes the hotel's destiny from a forgotten, rotting ruin into this massive global destination for dark tourism. They even added a hedge maze in 2015, which honestly is a wild story all on its own. But to truly get to the heart of this building, we got to look at why it even exists in the first place. See, it wasn't born out of horror at all. It was actually born from a medical miracle. The man who built it, Freeland Oscar Stanley, the co-inventor of the Stanley steamer automobile, was handed a terminal death sentence. He had tuberculosis, which they called the White Plague back then. His weight had dropped to like 90 pounds. His doctors literally sent him to the high, dry air of Colorado to just die in a tent. But remarkably, that high-altitude mountain air practically cured him. So in this supreme act of defiance against his own mortality, Stanley spent an absolute fortune hauling steel and timber up these treacherous mountain grades just to build this 48,000 square foot luxury resort in the wilderness. Now, when people think about trauma at the Stanley Hotel, they're usually picturing, spooky ghosts or phantom bartenders. But the true historical trauma, it was a terrifying, very physical disaster. Back in 1911, a storm completely knocked out the hotel's power. So the incredibly dedicated head chambermaid, Elizabeth Wilson, was sent to light the backup acetylene gas lamps. She walks into room 217 with a lit candle, completely unaware that the room is just filled with leaking gas. And boom. The explosion was so massive, it destroyed 10% of the entire hotel and literally blew Mrs. Wilson straight through the floorboards into the McGregor dining room on the floor below.
Miraculously, she survived the fall with just broken ankles. Actually, F.O. Stanley paid all her medical bills, promoted her, and she worked there until the day she died. But here's exactly where the history starts to blur into folklore. Because today, guests staying in room 217 regularly report interacting with what paranormal investigators call a residual energy. Former guests have gone on record saying Mrs. Wilson is basically a permanent visitor there who will neatly fold and put away her clothes. People literally wake up to find their suitcases fully unpacked. Or, get this, if they're an unmarried couple sharing a bed, they frequently report feeling this freezing cold force just pushing right between them. Now, what's really interesting about this mapping is how systematically we can organize the bewildering catalog of specific hauntings reported all over the property. Like, it's not just random bumps in the night. Down in the music room, people say F.O.'s wife, Flora Stanley, is still playing the piano keys late at night. Head up to room 407, and the former landowner, Lord Dunraven, is supposedly spotted peering right out the window.
Over in room 418, folks report coat hangers moving on their own, and little ghost children literally tickling their feet. And down in the concert hall, the spirits of a former employee named Paul and a homeless woman named Lucy are known to loudly demand that guests leave, or they'll respond directly to flashlight knocks. And honestly, the folklore gets even wilder. We're not just talking about elegant piano playing here. Up in room 401, a supposedly unfriendly male spirit has been known to touch guests and magically open locked closet doors. That's a terrifying encounter famously caught on camera by the paranormal investigator Jason Hawes. Meanwhile, in room 428, guests report this friendly cowboy ghost who kisses women on the forehead, plus the sounds of heavy furniture being dragged across the sloped roof. But my absolute favorite detail? The grounds have a literal pet cemetery. Spectral animals, like this golden retriever named Cassie and a white cat named Comanche, are said to just wander the halls. And keep in mind, these sightings totally predate King's own novel Pet Sematary. But if you really want to find the true epicenter of the eerie vibes, you have to head up to the 4th floor. Historically speaking, this space represents unseen labor. It was originally the attic. It had these super low ceilings and paper-thin walls, and it was used to house the nannies and the children of the wealthy elite staying below. From a sociological standpoint, it perfectly represents the hidden labor that kept the entire Stanley running. And the hauntings reported up here reflect that so perfectly. While the lower floors have this heavy, adult, almost formal atmosphere, the 4th floor echoes with playful phantom giggles and the sounds of isolated children playing in what's known as the never-ending hallway. Okay, let's put on our skeptic's lens for just a second. Why on earth do so many people experience these things? Well, it very often comes down to a super powerful psychological phenomenon called pareidolia. Basically, this is the tendency for our brains to perceive meaningful images or patterns in random, totally ambiguous stimuli. When you're standing in a massive, dark, echoing, isolated building, your brain gets absolutely desperate for sensory input. It just starts connecting dots that simply aren't there. For instance, tourists have spotted what they swear is the face of F.O. Stanley naturally woven into the folds of an American flag hanging above a fireplace. So you gotta ask, is it actually a monster, or is it just our brains frantically trying to make sense of the shadows? Couple that with another really fascinating concept, liminality. This is that disorienting, super eerie sense of being stuck in a transitional or in-between state. See, for decades, the Stanley was strictly a summer resort. That means for 9 months out of the year, it just sat there, completely abandoned, freezing alone in the harsh mountain winters. It passed through multiple owners, falling into deep, deep decay in the 1970s. When a building spends most of its life empty, existing right on the razor's edge of ruin, it absorbs this heavy atmosphere of place memory. You walk those halls today and you instinctively feel that transition, that heavy, trapped, suspended time. And this brilliantly illustrates why the physical environment of the Stanley is pretty much the ultimate haunted house simulator. Just look at the real environmental realities here. You're up at 7,500 feet, which naturally causes mild hypoxia or oxygen deprivation. And guess what? That is a known medical trigger for auditory hallucinations and the feeling of an invisible presence in the room. Plus, the hotel is built out of 1909 timber that violently expands and contracts in the freezing mountain temperatures, creating these loud metallic clacks and what sounds exactly like booming footsteps. Add in the Stanley cold drafts blowing up from unheated subterranean servant tunnels, and it all combines to create the perfect physical conditions to trick the human brain. Oh, and despite all those rumors about magnetic quartz supercharging the ghosts, soil surveys conclusively prove the bedrock beneath the hotel is just your standard schist. Which leads us to the absolute ultimate irony of the Stanley Hotel. It is a place where fiction has literally overwritten actual history. While pop culture vividly remembers the terrifying, deadly hedge maze from The Shining, the reality is that the original Stanley Hotel didn't even have one. They actually had to build a simulacrum, a totally fake hedge maze, in 2015 simply because tourists wouldn't stop demanding it to appease their expectations. They fully expected to see what they saw in a movie that was, by the way, actually shot on a soundstage in England and at a lodge over in Oregon. It's such a fascinating look at how our collective imagination literally dictates reality. And this brings us to a really thought-provoking question about why we even visit places like this. As the book The Dark Atlas puts it, we are tourists of trauma, consuming the history of overworked domestic staff and their isolated children. When we take these ghost tours, we're basically chasing thrills, right? But the ghosts we're hunting, they're very often just the historical echoes of real, everyday people who suffered real, tragic industrial accidents or died from deadly diseases while literally gasping for the mountain air that was supposed to save them. So the crucial point is, are we genuinely seeking the supernatural, or are we simply using places like the Stanley Hotel to safely consume historical trauma as entertainment? It's a heavy thought. Why is the human mind so incredibly drawn to inventing monsters in beautiful, isolated spaces? Next time you find yourself standing in an old, creaky building, I want you to listen to the silence, feel that chill in the air, and ask yourself, what are you really afraid of? Is it the ghosts of the past, or is it the incredibly powerful, reality-bending tricks of your own mind? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will catch you on the next explainer.